We would like to thank you for joining us for another episode of Looking to Jesus. As usual, I'm John. This is...
I'm Daniel Sanders, preacher for the Norwalk Church of Christ. I'm going to throw it out there again, close to Cedar Point, just south of Cedar Point, and also south of Lake Erie. Got some great fishing up here. If you're up our way, we'll be glad to have you.
What is this, like the marketing department?
Yeah, well, Sunday we had some visitors from church, and they were up here fishing. They came and stopped with us, so I had to throw that extra one in there today.
I see. I preach for the Church of Christ here in North Ridgeville, Ohio. So appreciate you joining us. If you're listening this week, thank you very much. And this week we are going to be talking somewhat about dispensations, covenants. And this week, Daniel, you're going to lead us more in this conversation.
Yeah, I had some different thoughts and had an approach from someone asking me about the difference in dispensation and covenants, being able to understand both, being able to look at both. You know, we've been studying the book of Hebrews on Sunday mornings, and this question kind of came up, well, dispensation versus covenant, what are the dispensations? What are, are they the same as the covenants? Are they not the same as the covenants? And I thought, I was asked about doing this, and I was like, well, maybe we could be able to look at it in this matter of being able to discuss it in this podcast together. And so wanted to be able to just do a little bit of a background on this, being able to talk about dispensations, being able to understand, maybe just looking at a definition of dispensation and also covenant, and being able to go from there, being able to discuss these things, understand these different timelines and different things with the dispensations, being able to talk about the covenants. But as we kind of tie it all together, as our theme is being able to look to Jesus. And I think that is the key thing in all of this, is to be able to understand things, but also understand how it all goes back to looking to Jesus. So that's what we want to be able to maybe discuss a little bit here today.
And I would like to say covenant is a biblical word.
Yeah.
Dispensation is a churchy word.
Yeah.
And by that I mean, I don't think you ever find the word dispensation in the Bible. Do you
find
actually?
It? Give me 1 second.
Is it actually the word dispensation?
Give me a second, and I will be able to tell you, because I know that it's in there. Ephesians chapter 1 and chapter 3. I was going to say Ephesians 4, but then I was like, no, I know it's in Ephesians. So it's mentioned twice.
Okay, so this is Ephesians 1, that in the dispensation of the fullness of the times, he might gather together in one all things in Christ. So that, just out of curiosity, and I didn't realize I'd forgotten to use that word. So that word there for dispensation, according to Strong's, and it actually shows up other places. Now let's see, and that's the King James. 1 Corinthians 9 at verse 17. I'm just curious now, sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
For if I do this willingly, I have a reward, but if against my will, I've been entrusted with a stewardship. There's something there. But if against my will, a dispensation of the gospel is committed to me. So where the New King James translates it as stewardship, King James is dispensation. It's that word. Anyway, sorry for that squirrel.
That's all right. That's all right. You opened it up, and I was like, oh, it doesn't say that word, and I knew that it said it because of having discussions and being able to look at that.
Yeah. So Strong says the definition is administration. Okay, so I understand now why the King James translated it as dispensation and the others as stewardship. It's an administration of a household or estate, specifically a religious, however you want to put it. But that's the idea. So administration or dispense, like when you have a will and you have an estate that's being dispensed.
Yes.
Distributed.
Yeah. Webster, just using some different, I was just trying to pin down some different things. Webster offers a definition kind of similar to what you had just said. That which is dispensed or bestowed, a system of principles or rights enjoined. For instance, again, we're going to talk about it a little bit, the Mosaic dispensation, the gospel dispensation, including the former Levitical rights, and also the latter scheme of redemption that we have in Christ, by Christ. And then Easton also offers some things about the method or scheme according to which God carries out his purpose towards men, called a dispensation. I think looking at some of this, that kind of fits a little bit with what's described and how the word dispensation's used there in Ephesians. And maybe there's a little bit of difference there, as you were talking there in 1 Corinthians about the dispensation or the stewardship, as the New King James might use there in that word.
So where you want to start? You want to start by talking about dispensations?
Yeah,
you want to start by talking about covenants?
Let's talk about dispensation. I think it leads into the covenant side as well. You know, if you categorize dispensation, there's some people that will come up with all these different dispensations. Some would say 9, some would say 12, some would say maybe even 17. I think I
was sharing the story before we started recording.
Yeah.
And someone was talking about the 17 Bible periods. And I'm like, and it was these, and I mean, once you hear it, it's like, okay. And it was like, pre-Babel, post-Babel.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay, I know what they're talking about. Pre-flood, post-flood.
Yeah.
And then Babel. And then Abraham. And then, okay, before Goshen, after Goshen, or whatever it is.
Yeah, you get into the different things,
you're just dealing with time blocks. You're dealing with a timeline.
Exactly. And I think when we look at dispensations, it's a matter of timeline. So it's a matter of, we could say that, wouldn't you agree that it's just kind of a matter of what personal opinions, like my timeline of being able to categorize things maybe a little bit different from your timeline?
Well, I think the timeline is what it is.
Yeah.
When we're talking about dispensations, what we're talking about is God's will being dispensed.
Yeah.
So how did God reveal his will? For example, pre-flood, post-flood.
Yeah.
Well, he was dealing, we think about the patriarchal dispensation in the sense that God was dealing with the patriarchs individually.
Right.
And so whether he was dealing with Noah or Abraham, well, he dealt with both the same way, namely individually. Now you could talk about, well, with Abraham, you have that moment in time where you have, okay, the covenant. And so you could say, okay, so that timeline, you could break it up into different chunks, but God was still dealing with Abraham individually.
Yeah.
Whether it was before or after.
Yeah.
So the same type of dispensation, okay, how is God revealing his will?
Right.
And he's doing it the same way. And so you may break it up into different chunks, but that's what we're talking about, right? Like, okay, how does God reveal his will?
Yeah. And I think when you look at it, generalizing it, I think we could be able to categorize it into 3.
I'm all about generalization.
I know.
Simplify.
Absolutely. Being able to simplify those things. That's what we can be able to make. You can get a little bit more specific on it, but it would still fit in these 3 generalized categories. For instance, again, we have the patriarchal. You could talk about the time pre-garden, post-garden, and then after the garden, then we see Abraham. We see the other mentionings of the seed of Abraham before Abraham, we have the different ones where we get to Noah, we get to Enoch. Enoch was the man that walked with God. We see Methuselah being mentioned, Adam, all those different individuals, all these different people in the patriarchal time, being able to lead up before Israel, before Mount Sinai, and all these different events that take place there.
One of the verses in thinking about this discussion, and this is Hebrews 1, and we're probably going to come back to this passage more than once, especially towards the end of the podcast. This is Hebrews 1, verse 1. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets. And that's really what we're talking about. Various times, various ways.
Absolutely.
So it is interesting to think about the dispensations as far as just pardon me, I'm not trying to get us on too much of a tangent, but like before Sodom and Gomorrah, and when the Lord appears to Abraham and he comes in the form of a man, and there's 2 angels with him who are also in the form of men. And it's like, okay, so that's how the Lord is conveying his will at this point. But then other times you have just, for example, Peter's up on the housetop of Simon the tanner's house, and all of a sudden there's a vision. So it's like, okay, how's the Lord revealing his will? It's through a vision.
Yeah.
And so Joseph in the dungeon, you have dreams, you have the interpretation, you have various ways and at various times.
Yeah, absolutely. We see so many different circumstances of God being able to use different ways, different means to be able to relay his message.
Right.
His message was very similar in all these different times. Listen to me,
Right.
obey me.
Right.
You know, there's that side of it that, and he spoke to us the same. It spoke the same word, maybe being a little bit more specific at times. But as we think about it all, it's listen to me, obey me, do my will. You know, and we could see that in these different moments of the patriarchal time. You know, Noah. What do we learn about him? In a time of evil, in a time of distress, in a time where there was just so much chaos and violence that's being described, everybody kind of doing living however they wanted to live. Noah found what? He found grace in the eyes of God. So there was an understanding of doing God's will, knowing God's will. You know, it was revealed. You know, we look at the genealogy account there in the previous chapter, in chapter 5. I just mentioned it a moment ago. What about Enoch? Enoch, what? He walked with God. God did not want him to see death because he was a one who walked with him, and he lived on the earth for 300 plus years, different than all the other people who were living hundreds of years more, twice or even 3 times almost the amount of what Enoch lived, because he found grace, you know, or he walked around. God didn't want to see him. He found favor.
Yeah. And you have even the build up to the flood, and you have the sons of God.
Yeah.
And as it speaks about the sons of God going to the daughters of men. And most think, rather than getting too fanciful with it, you had those who were following God, and you had those who were not following God, and you had intermarriages.
Yeah.
And it's the repeated lesson, sort of like with Solomon, that his heart turned away from God because of those wives. And you see the same thing. As you have those who followed God. So in order to follow God, you have to have a revelation of God's will.
Yeah.
And that's where the dispensation comes in.
Right.
God was communicating. God communicated his will, and you had those who were following it. It may have been in a limited way, or it was however God saw fit. God, who in various times and in various ways spoke to us in times past by the prophets.
Yeah. So you have that dispensation. Could we say there was some different events that take place, but again, God's will happening there in this patriarchal time. Then we kind of jump ahead into the next dispensation, which kind of covers really the rest of the Old Testament. Again, generalizing, making things simple for us, is the Mosaic dispensation, which is when the law was given. We understand more of the we have more revealed to us of what the law was, what God revealed to Moses, how it was translated over there, revealed to the children of Israel. And, that beginning of time, we could say from Moses to Jesus. And then there are different events that people could be able to kind of put and say, again, generalizing everything leads us into that. God gives us the law there in Exodus 20. It's revealed on what they need to do, how they are to follow it. God provides all the different things of being able to help them when it comes time to the temple. He helps them be able to know how to design it, how to transport it, because they were having to take it from place to place to place, being able to worship God and offer sacrifices to God.
As far as the tabernacle and all those things. One of the questions I had, and to just entertain it, is why the different dispensations? Why do we go from, in Genesis, where God is dealing with people individually? And it's like, okay, well, why doesn't that just continue? If it was good enough for hundreds or thousands of years, why does it not continue? Why is it when Moses comes on the scene, all of a sudden we need to have what we think, we have the law given from Sinai? And the way I answered that was, we're moving from the family and to a nation.
Yeah.
And granted, it's still a family,
Yeah.
but it's a lot bigger family.
Exactly.
When they come out of Egypt, and it's hundreds of thousands.
Yeah. When they're with 12,
Yeah.
and then we get introduced to Egypt, Egypt's scared of it. Egypt's scared to death of Israel because how large they become.
And so we're dealing with a lot more people, and it's going from family to, it's like, okay, it's the nation. And sometimes it uses that national language. For example, Jacob, no longer shall I call you Jacob, I'll now call you Israel.
Yeah.
And you'll have that language being used. But we have this, okay, why did God do things differently all of a sudden? Because you go from the patriarchal dispensation where nothing's written down.
Yeah.
Nothing's written down. And then all of a sudden you have, okay, now it's written down. And Moses was commanded to write it down.
Right.
And I don't know if you would just say God knew that they needed it to be written down. And you would have the law being read, what is it, like every 7 years? And you have the 10 Commandments, and you have the law, what we think of as the law.
Yeah, absolutely. We see we see all these different things again. There's needs to be something kind of a routine, being able to have something for being able to handle the whole, like you said, a whole large nation of individuals, being able to take care of those different things. And we see, the different sacrifices that are being offered. God laid out a plan for Israel being able to handle all these different things and being able to come together, worship, and do these things.
And within that dispensation, I also thought we might mention the Urim and the Thummim, and where you have, okay, if you have questions, God has answers, and you have the high priest, and you have the way to speak to God, to get answers. Now, where they're going to get in trouble is when they don't use God's telephone, when they don't ask the questions.
Yeah, we see the corruption of everything kind of.
But all through the Old Testament, the remainder of the Old Testament, you had, and you can break that up into different time frames.
Yeah.
You can think about, okay, you have the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Okay, they cross over, and you can talk about, and you can start breaking it up. So then you have judges, then you have kings, then you have divided kingdom, then and you can break it up.
Yeah.
But the whole rest, it's the Mosaic dispensation because they were supposed to be keeping the law.
Yeah.
That whole time.
Yeah.
Whether we're talking about all the things happen pre-captivity, during captivity, post-captivity.
Yeah.
They're supposed to be keeping the law.
Yeah.
That's why we call it the Mosaic dispensation.
Like we were discussing before we started, it's, you mentioned the minor prophets. What was the routine? What was the situation? What was being told throughout all of those? Repent. Change. Turn back to me.
Right.
Return to me. Please return to me. You've fallen away. Then you see different prophets maybe saying things just a little different, but the message was still the same.
Yeah.
Repent. God's, I mentioned Malachi, about how Malachi said, the Lord said, shut the door unless they change it. They need to turn back to me, or else it's going to be the end of it.
And it uses the language of, and the word of the Lord came to, like right now in my daily videos, I'm doing Jeremiah. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah. The word of the Lord came to whichever prophet it was. And you start having revelations. And it wasn't just about keep the law. There was also, this is what I'm going to do with Assyria. This is what I'm going to do with Egypt. This is what I'm going to do with Edom. And this is what I'm going to do with Judah and Israel.
Yeah.
And so you have these revelations happening. And God, who at various times spoke to us in times past by the prophets.
Right. So you lead into the last dispensation, again, categorizing, generalizing everything. You get into the third one. We would call it the gospel or the Christian dispensation. We go from the Mosaic law, as you mentioned there in Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 2 this time. Now he's using his son. Now he's using his son, Jesus Christ. So now we're getting into the point where it's not just for Israel anymore. Now Jesus has come in, he's given his life, and now the Christian gospel dispensation has been revealed, where it's now available for all mankind. The message is still similar to what the Mosaic dispensation was. God said, keep my law, obey me, follow me. Now we have it with all people being able to follow Jesus. And as we were mentioning, as you were asking the question earlier, is the word dispensation used in the Bible? Ephesians 3:2 goes on to say, if you have heard the dispensation,
I'm
dropping
episode
the hammer.
Episode 3, and he, man, I apologize, and he won't let me live it down.
No, that's just me.
But I can't believe I was wrong so early. Actually, I can believe that very easily. But you know, even within Jesus, and sometimes people get caught up in this issue. For example, I threw one out at Bible class the other night, where it just takes just a little bit of a deeper understanding. For example, we were in Galatians talking about Jesus born by a woman under the law. Okay, well, so Jesus, he's our example, right? And he kept the old law. Yes. Oh, so that means we have to keep the old law. It takes a deeper understanding.
Yeah.
And so there's a recognition of when Jesus went to the cross, and we say what Jesus said, this is the blood of the new covenant.
Well,
and it's like, no, he's establishing a new covenant. He did keep the law.
Yeah.
But he does not expect us to keep the old law.
Yeah. We see the introduction of things where
yes.
We start seeing under the gospel Christian dispensation where, for instance, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, you have heard it this way. I know that some of it was, well, they were not even keeping it then. But Jesus says, I tell you a new way,
right.
Or I tell you this way. This is what you're to be doing. We look at those different situations there in Matthew 5 where, they had been taught this way. They had learned this way. We see it was still similar, but Jesus kind of took it to the next level, a little bit further, but being able to, how can we exceed? How can we make things better? And Jesus offered us a better way under this Christian dispensation. He's offered a way for all mankind, right. And being able to give us life. Again, that goes back to what I was going to mention there in Ephesians 3, verse 2. If indeed you have heard of the dispensation of the grace of God, right. Which was given to me to you. Again, leading into that third dispensation. You could talk about, the events, whether you want to talk about, pre-post Jerusalem destruction there in the early 70s, 69, that time frame. You can start putting some different events. You can put some different events in there within this, but again, it still falls within that same. We're under right. This day to the Christian gospel dispensation.
And Scripture does sometimes break it up into those chunks. When it talks about this will not happen unless the falling away happens first.
Right.
And so you do have some of those things, they were prophesied.
Yeah.
And so, okay, the Lord's not going to return unless this happens. Now, that has already happened. And regardless, even those things, I was just mindful of Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost, mm-hmm. when you have them speaking in tongues, you have all the people there saying, oh, these guys are drunk. And then Peter stands up and says, no, they're not drunk, since it's only the third hour of the day. Verse 16, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel, and it shall come to pass in the last days, says God, that I will do these things. Verse 21, it shall come to pass, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And those were the last days. These are the last days. We've been in the last days.
Yes.
And so for those out there who say, oh, we're looking, are we living in the last days? I see what's happening in the Middle East, and I think, though, no. We've been in the last days for a long time.
Oh, yeah.
There's going to be a last day, 1 Corinthians 15, the last trumpet and things like that.
Right.
But we're already in the last days. We're talking about the Christian dispensation. We're talking about the new covenant.
Yeah, and that's what we look at. And that leading into the next part is, okay, what about covenants? Let's just go ahead into those different things, because we kind of understand the different dispensations. Well, now we have covenants. We could talk about the promise. Again, I'm going to pull out my dictionary definitions as well for us to just be able to have a better understanding of everything. Easton would describe it as a contract or an agreement between two parties. A word that we also may use, and what we may use that's maybe a little more familiar, is testament. As that some of that agreement. And Webster also kind of offers some similar thoughts of a mutual agreement or consent between two or more persons, and to be able to do so of the same act or some act or thing a stipulation or contract, kind of understanding these different things. It could be in writing or it could be in action. And that's where I think we could look at, there were some different promises that God made. For instance, Noah, what kind of contract or agreement he make? He offered the rainbow and a reminder of, I'm not going to destroy the water or the earth by water again. We talk about the contract agreement that Abraham was offered with God about his seed being a great nation. What did they have to do? Well, we see the agreement or law of circumcision. So we see some of the different things happen, but in particular, when we talk about things that are under the old covenant, we see going back in the Mosaic law. God gives the law. He gives what we call the Ten Commandments. He gives the law to Israel. Here's my law. Keep my law. Obey my law. Follow my law. And these different things are to be followed and adhered to. That's what God wanted. And there were stipulations for them to be able to follow. And what was the promise to them? Not an eternal, but a physical land. Israel was going to be able to have a nation, right, a land for them to be able to dwell in, that land flowing with milk and honey.
Yeah, you have the seed and the nation and the land promise.
Yeah.
And in those things, two of those things were fulfilled before Jesus, the nation and the land, and then, of course, Jesus being the seed. And Galatians makes the point, and you see this, you mentioned the Sermon on the Mount earlier. All of those things are looking to Jesus. All of those things are pointing to Jesus.
Yes.
And so when Jesus says, I didn't come to destroy the law, I came to fulfill it. And that's what he did.
Yeah.
And when he fulfilled it, okay, now, and you have there in Hebrews where it talks all about that fulfillment and the better promises and the better covenant and the better high priest and the better, and we're talking about the attributes, the benefits of the new covenant. When God says, this is the covenant I will make with them, their lawless deeds I will remember no more. There's a reason it's called the dispensation of grace. Because if there's a remembrance of sins every year, well, I'm thankful that you passed over, but I know what's coming next year.
Yeah.
And so we're thankful to be able to look to Jesus.
And as we look at that, under this old law, under this old covenant, this Old Testament, we see blood was also being offered. When we look at the agreement or here was a stipulation for Israel was you got to shed blood, and so they were taking the blood of bulls and goats to be able to offer that. And again, as you were mentioning, they had to offer it every year. Had to go back and and God gave them the law, gave them the understanding. Here's how you're able to offer these different. We talk about different offerings that were being offered, but in particular, talking about the Old Testament or the old law, offering the blood of bulls and goats. And you're mentioning Hebrews, and I have a few different reference points there. Hebrews 10, verse 4. Here's where we see, we're offering the blood of bulls and goats or calves every year, but it says there, it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. So we see and understand there's something better, greater that is to come with a better covenant, a better sacrifice, being able to lead into Jesus.
Yeah, I was looking there in Hebrews and just this idea, because people sometimes they want to break it into so many different chunks.
Yeah.
And to start tying, to tie in the idea of dispensation and covenant. This is Hebrews 8 at verse 6. But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, inasmuch as he is also a mediator of a better covenant, which was established on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, then no place would have been sought for a second. Now, we could talk about any number of covenants where the word is used in the Old Testament, but that's talking very generally, I suppose. I don't know if you'd even use the word general, but overall, it's the first covenant, the second covenant.
Yeah.
That's what we're dealing with.
And again, when we look at, I was mentioning some different promises or contracts kind of leading up into the Old Testament, whether it was with Abraham in the patriarchal time, there's everything. But when we get to that Mosaic timeline for the nation, for the large amount of people, because again, we're talking about the Christian gospel dispensation for us. We're a large group of people. It's not just for just one select individual or anything, or one family. again, I guess I could say it is for one family, being the Christian family, but we're all scattered about. We're all in different areas, and God has given us the ability to be able to know him, to be able to seek him, to know this better promise, this better covenant. Christ offering himself as that blood's offering, that sacrifice, shedding his blood on the cross for that better promise, for that better covenant that was established for us, and in this new timeline of the Christian gospel dispensation.
To just think about how everything pointed to Jesus. Adam and Eve, when the Lord is talking to the devil, and I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. And that's talking about Jesus. When you have Noah, and you have, when that example is used more than once in the New Testament, in thinking about God's judgment, and we think about all those figures, Abraham, it's like in your seed, and you have Jacob, the promises about a ruler not departing until Shiloh comes. You have Moses saying, God's going to raise up a prophet like me. I mean, you could go on and on and on. Elijah, you mentioned Malachi, and what's in it in Malachi where God says, Elijah's coming.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not Elijah in the flesh. That's John the Baptist.
Right.
And Jesus explains that. It's like, oh, everything's pointing to Jesus.
Yeah.
And it's like there's two sides of the cross. There's that side and there's this side. And so I guess we should mention with that, where's the passage in Hebrews where it talks about...
I was going to mention, maybe it's Hebrews 8:13, because I had that. It says, in what he says, a new covenant, he's made the first obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. I don't know if that's the one that you're looking for.
The one I was thinking of was, this is 9 at verse 15. For this reason, he's the mediator of the new covenant.
Yes. By
means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance.
That was my next verse that I had on my list.
Okay, and so when we think about the Lord's sacrifice, and I would suggest even there in verse 15, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant. So does that only go back as far as Moses? Does that only go back as far as Abraham? Or is that talking about all the faithful before the cross? I think that's the idea.
Yeah.
That it's talking about.
Well, I think
it's not just going forward.
I think
no. If anyone ever is going to be saved or was saved, there's only one way to the Father, and it's always been Jesus, the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world.
I think that kind of lays it out. That I think it applies for all those under that old covenant, because he goes on there in Hebrews chapter 11. And he starts mentioning all of these different individuals that were faithful to God. And it goes back to...
He doesn't start at Moses.
He doesn't start back at Moses. He goes and starts back with Abel.
Right.
Then he starts talking about Noah, Abraham, Sarah, all these different individuals. And then I think, you look at verse 11 or chapter 11, verse 13 down to verse 16, where it talks about all these have died before. All these were individuals of faith, and they're looking forward to a better country that is a heavenly land or a heavenly country where God can be their God. That's what we're looking forward to. All these other individuals, they lived, they died, they were under this old law. They were looking to that physical land, and now there's something that's better offered, and that's been offered through Christ, through the ability that Christ gave his life and came into this world and gave his life on the cross for you and I. And that's where we kind of look at this and may say, okay, here's why we look to Jesus.
Yeah.
We're no longer under these different covenants or under the old dispensations or the old covenant. We're under something better, greater, right. And being able to have this, as Peter writes, a living hope. We're looking forward to that, and Christ made that possible for you and I through his blood and being able to establish this new covenant, making the first obsolete and establishing a new covenant, being able to seek and serve him.
Yeah, and I mean, we're, at that point, we're to chapter 12, and that's where this whole podcast began.
Yeah.
Looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. Since we're surrounded by this cloud of witnesses, it's like, okay, what are they testifying? Look to Jesus.
Yeah.
And we're just thankful to be on this. We're thankful to be able to look to Jesus just as they look to Jesus.
Yeah.
I think we should be perhaps even more thankful we're on this side of the cross.
Right.
They had they had faith in that it had not happened yet. We have to have faith because we were not there 2,000 years ago. And so we believe the witnesses, and we believe those witnesses, and we believe the witnesses of the apostles, foundation of the apostles, as Ephesians says.
Jesus told, when he's speaking to Thomas, when he comes to him after, Thomas, I need to be able to see the print of that. I need to see where they drove those nails. I need to see where the side was pierced. And Jesus said, here I am. Hear me, see me, touch me, feel me, do all these different things. And then goes on to say, Thomas, you have believed because you've seen me.
Right.
Blessed are those who have not seen yet have believed. That speaks to you and I today.
Yep. And I, when we think about the Christian dispensation, and as probably most of us, and we just don't think of it this way, and we don't probably appreciate it like we should, we're Gentiles. We're Gentiles. So we could look at the Christian dispensation and recognize, okay, there were blocks of time. And what I'm thinking of is when the Lord was talking to the apostles and he says, tarry in Jerusalem, and the word is going to go out from Jerusalem to Samaria, Judea, and eventually it's going to get to Cornelius. And all of a sudden, whoa, God has granted unto the Gentiles repentance unto life.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden the door is thrown wide open. It's a new time. It had been prophesied to happen.
Right.
It had been prophesied to happen, but God has granted it. And so now we all can look to Jesus.
Yeah. And this time that we're living in, this time frame, this dispensation, if you want to call it that, under this new covenant, they're tied together. The covenant is in the timeline of the Christian gospel dispensation, a new covenant being offered, available for all men. When does it end? That's the other question, because we see there was an ending of time for the old covenant. There was an ending of time for the patriarchal and Mosaic dispensation. When does that end for us? It's when Jesus returns.
Yeah. I think Jesus spoke to that in the account of Lazarus there in John 11 when Lazarus has died. And Jesus says, your brother will rise again. John 11:23. Martha said, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. That's the last day.
Yeah.
We're in the last days.
Right.
There will be a last day. And that's when the Lord returns. To think about that timeline. Oh, this is 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15 gives the timeline as it's, but each in his own order, talking about the resurrection. Christ the first fruits, afterwards those who are Christ at his coming. Then comes the end when he delivers the kingdom to God the Father, when he puts an end to all rule and all authority, for he must reign till he's put all enemies under his feet. When did Jesus start ruling, and when will Jesus give the kingdom back to God? That whole thing is a dispensation.
Yeah.
That whole thing is a time block. And so then you get to the end of chapter 15, and it's in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. The trumpet will sound, the dead will arise. And that's when we will be changed.
Yeah.
And that's a different dispensation, I guess you would say. And so we recognize, and that's the hope we have, the one hope that we have. Well, that was a good discussion, Daniel. You got anything else on your notes?
Nope, that was it.
All right. Hopefully this study's been beneficial for those who have questions. Any final thoughts or anything?
Again, just as the theme of this is, we look to Jesus.
Yeah.
And all these different things we can learn from the different timelines, patriarchal, Mosaic timelines, of being able to look to Jesus because there was something better that was going to be offered, revealed that was going to be offered. Here we are living in this new time, this new covenant, this new promise, that we can be able to look to Jesus. Under the old law, we see the covenant, the promise, the agreement that was made. And here Christ also offering himself as giving his life. And we see a new testament, a new covenant being born, and being able to have that look to him. Look to him as the author and finisher of our faith, and being able to look to him for strength, comfort, guidance, knowing that there's something better in store for us.
Yeah. I did not know where we were going with this discussion, by the way. And sometimes when people talk about dispensations, sometimes they start talking about premillennialism.
Well,
this is not going to begin another 45-minute podcast. But anyway, but I will say this. we look to Jesus, and when you look at how the church has described it, all of this should make us appreciate a better high priest, better promises, a better covenant. Now, and all the things that go into that, in the church, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. There's neither male nor female, neither free nor slave. The problem that a lot of people in the religious world have today with dispensations is they're looking for some future dispensation where all of a sudden the Lord is going to establish his kingdom over in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And they think there's one plan of salvation for Gentiles, and there's another plan of salvation for those who are Jews today. And it's like, no, there's one plan of salvation.
Right.
There's one faith, there's one Lord, there's one body, there's one baptism, there's one God, there's one Spirit, there's one hope. Get on board. This is the dispensation. We're in the last days, and we're waiting for the Lord's return.
Yeah. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life.
How many ways are there?
There's the way. I think he was speaking on a singular level there.
Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that in. But we appreciate everyone joining us. Feel free to share. What do they always say, Daniel? Share, like, share, and subscribe.
There you go.
All those things. So,
and you can find our information on the church websites as well, on the Facebook page. We're trying to share it out with everybody and be able to get the ease of getting on there and listening.
Yeah. What's the website there in Norwalk? What's the
church website there is norwalkchurch.org.
norwalkchurch.org.
Yes.
Okay. Here it is nrcoc.net. And so we'll be posting. We post these, and we post everything else we do on our websites, Facebook, all that good stuff. So appreciate everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for the study, helping us all to look to Jesus. Tune in next week, please.